Okay, some of mine I can go quicker on because Oliver did a good job talking about it. But similar discussion, different building and different experience, I think. This was, I'm going to cover a little bit why heritage. I'm really going to talk about a Grosvenor case study, which is in Westminster, London. And then I'm going to talk about what we have found on this project, which is a case study project I'm using with my industrial funding partner for my PhD, as sort of the key planning challenges, why they've come up, and what the issue and the conflict really seems to be about. So first, why heritage? Obviously, we've got a reduction target. In the UK, the building sector is about 40% of total emissions, and we know that buildings maybe aren't that efficient, and there's a lot of quick win, good potential for energy savings in the building sector, although that's broad. Now this is a very controversial image, but go with me on this. First of all, most of our homes today are going to be occupied in 2050, and about a third of them were built before 1930 and are solid walls, so they're considered sort of historic or historic effective. And a very, very small percentage of these, only 1.3, currently have insulation. Now this image comes out of the UK Home Survey, and it talks about the SAP ratings of the existing buildings, and you've got, it's by year, and it's basically what you're seeing is as the buildings get older, their SAP rating, which is the efficiency of their wall, is getting worse. Now there's been a lot of recent work by people like SPAB, which has been repeated by groups like the STBA, talking about how valid, and basically they say completely invalid, is this sort of chart. The problem is, what I find, is that while I agree with them from an academic perspective of understanding whether the SAP rating, so your U value of an existing wall, is what we think it should be or how it actually performs. The problem is, even if it performs half, if the U value is half of what we think it should be, that's still, let's say, twice as bad as what it needs to be. So there's this problem between academic thinking and our understanding of academic number and rigor and practical rigor. And so sometimes the message that's coming out is confusing for industry. And I think we in academia need to be a bit more careful about how we get excited about our numbers and the messages we give out, because actually it leads to a lot of confusion when people hear, I heard this wall performs just as well. It doesn't perform just as well, it performs better than we thought, and there's this difference, and that really needs to be teased out much better by people in the field. So what I would say is, maybe the walls aren't performing as bad as we think, but half as well as bad is still not great. And also, I'll do it this way. Also, if you've been in an old building, I really don't know anyone who lives in an old building or has been in a Victorian terrace house or an old Georgian house or a cottage and says, gosh, it's really warm. I mean, we just know, talk to anyone who lives in these type of properties, they're not warm. We know that. We know there's problems. So we've really not got to get wrapped up in, but the walls perform better. So what is the government sort of doing? We know that it's an issue. We know we've got to address it. A third of the stock. And the government's done a lot. We've got things like the Green Deal. We've got improvements to the Building Regulations Part L. We've got things like the feed-in tariff, the renewable heat incentive. We've got DEC pathways, everything from national level telling us, yes, let's move forward, let's improve the energy efficiency, it's on the agenda, it's a good idea. And then when you go to the policies, I don't think they're as clear as Oliver's made them out to be. It depends on who determines what the answer is. So when you say that the public benefits of mitigating the effects of climate change should be weighed against the harm to the heritage assets, you're really talking apples and oranges. Who decides the weight of a benefit and the weight of the harm? And you can make that argument to your planning officer, but it's really up to that planning officer and that council and how they make that decision. There is no national guidance for how these things should actually be weighed, and that's the problem. PPS 5 now no longer exists, This has been replaced by the NPPF, which is even more vague, which only says local planning authorities should actively support energy efficiency improvements to existing buildings, although it also tells them they need to actively support protection of heritage. It doesn't tell them how, it doesn't tell them how to measure it or how to prioritize. So I don't agree that the policy is clear. And that's kind of where we're all operating today. It's very complicated. So the Grosvenor case study is a grade 2 listed Georgian terrace house, which is here. This is the project team. Grosvenor is a private landlord, long-term landlord, developer, stakeholder in London. They've been around for 300 years. I presume they wish to be around for at least 300 more. Most of their property, is they call the London estate, is in Mayfair and Belgravia in London, so it's in Westminster. And so they are thinking long-term about their projects, and they see energy as an issue in the future. They see the changing regulations affecting them as a business. They do really care about the stewardship. Their USP is this heritage feature. You know, that is what they sell on. They sell on this kind of old heritage appeal. So they have no interest in getting rid of it because they bank on it. But they do see that it needs to be improved, and they see that the regulations, things like you won't be able to rent a building potentially with an EPC rating of less than a certain level, will affect their business in the future. So they're concerned, and they want to know what can they do, and they have 4,000 properties overall, and I think at least 400 listed buildings, and the majority of their buildings are in conservation areas. So this is completely relevant to them. So they wanted to go ahead with the project. Now these were the project objectives, quite a lot. And they're starting out in the process, right? So like a lot of people, I think, today, and they're the client side, they have no technical training. They let the buildings, they refurbish the building, they hire architects, they hire engineers, they hire consultants. They know they need to do something, but actually their skill set is probably not where it needs to be. And they are not confident that they know what to do, or that the consultants, because then they interview a myriad of consultants, and the consultants all tell them they need to do different things. So, there isn't a clear message out there necessarily of what we should be doing. And I think, again, this leads to a lot of confusion in the industry. That confusion is then confounded upon to the public and leads to people just generally having a lack of confidence in the energy efficiency push, because there is no consistent message. So what did Grosvenor want to do? They wanted to investigate the effectiveness of new sustainable technologies suitable for retrofitting historic buildings, so that they had some confidence. They really wanted to engage and work collaboratively and closely with Westminster City Council and English Heritage to clarify the planning constraints, because it does come up as a problem consistently. They wanted an exemplar project. They do feel that as a long-term and, let's say, wealthy steward of a large part of London heritage, that they have a role to play in leading the way, and that they have the assets and money available to do these types of projects, and that they do feel they should be doing these types of projects. Most of their end users are high-end tenants. Their properties are very expensive. So they want to understand how to sell energy efficiency to a high-end user, which, I think is fair enough. When you have a lot of money, you cannot sell energy efficiency on your bills being lower. They don't care. So if you can't sell it on the bills being lower, but Grosvenor feels it's still important, how can they sell it? How can you sell this as a concept to people who may not have finance as their main priority? And to further that along, they wanted to assess the relationship between the cost and value of what this would mean for their estate. And they want to undertake a 2-year post-occupancy monitoring program and benchmark that against, let me just go backwards, 125, which is just here. So they're doing quite a number of refurbishments on the road. So if that's north, we've got a building right here, which they're doing to their normal standard. So they're refurbishing that one today, and they're going to put monitoring equipment in both, so then they can compare how the improvements are going against a typical refurbishment project. So here's the street, and this is the current state of the building. The building was in hotel use, and they want to change it back to residential use. It's here. Now, it's a little hard to tell from this picture, but what I should say about listing is also very complicated. It's grade 2 listed, but the building is listed in a group. So many listings are actually done in a group, which means the building was not necessarily listed for its specific internal features or internal characteristics that made it unique or special. It was listed as part of a 5-block group here about how all of the buildings contribute to the streetscape. That is the purpose of the listing. So now, if you go back to what Oliver has said about why was the building listed, why is it considered significant, I think this is something that's maybe not well understood by the officers or even by English Heritage who have to uphold it, because all they hear is it's listed, and then often we're not discussing why was the building listed and what's the best way to really discuss the reasons for the listing and to enhance that and preserve that. Rather, there tends to be a blanket approach applied to these buildings in terms of, well, it's listed, so you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, or this or that, or anything else, and don't touch it. But as you can see, the building's really not in great shape, and it's not particularly interesting as far as terrace houses go. So the building was analyzed. Here it is kind of in axonometric, and the biggest loss is through wall heat loss, and the second loss is through air tightness and ventilation. So those are big arrows here. And we've got lots of little arrows. They're hard to read, so I'm going to read them off the screen here. Appliances and cooking, hot water, doors and window leakage, roof leakage, ground floor, fans and pumps. And you can see here it all adds up to 21 tons of CO2 per year. That's sort of the basis. And so what was wrong with the building? It has absolutely no insulation, really bad air leakage, single glazing, lots of cold gapping and bridging. And how did we know this? We did a lot of investigation into the building to actually try and state. So here's some thermal imaging. Now this picture, everyone, when we got this, everyone was really shocked. Like, what is that? Because that's here, you don't see it, right? But it's glowing white hot. That's the hot water tank just on the other side of the wall. It doesn't have a sleeve on it, and the heat from the tank is just pouring out the wall. I mean, these are the things we don't see about buildings. Yeah?
Just out of interest there, did you have a value for the temperature on the wall there?
Yes, I can't remember what it is though. 15 to 24.1. So it's at 20. It's right up at 24.1. You can see the severe heat loss at the window edging. You can see it at things like the joints of the floors, the windows from the outside. The building is leaking, and we knew that, but we could start to see where the problems are. Also, air tightness testing. Now the rooms were pressure tested, so you do the big air pressure test, and the building came in at 17.22 meters cubed per hour per meter squared, which really is more important to just look at the maximum allowable under the current Part L is 10, so we know that we're leaking a lot. But also we did something called smoke testing. Now, what's great about these pictures is you don't really see smoke, right? What you would want to see is smoke billowing into the room. The reason you don't see smoke is it's being sucked into these cracks and straight up, and actually the smoke was coming out the top of the building. It was acting like a stack, so it went through the party walls, where you have old construction, you've got a lot of the mortar, it's got little leaks, little cracks, even the stud walls, through the floors, straight up like a massive chimney. The building was operating like a huge chimney, and it was fascinating. Now we actually got worried about how much smoke was pouring out the top, so we went to the neighbors. Interestingly, the party walls are so thick, it didn't go into the neighbor's house, it went straight out the top. But that's good. I mean, it would be bad to know that you have that kind of easy sharing between your neighbor. So small favors, it wasn't going into the neighbor's house and smoking them out, but the air leakage in this house is a real problem. So how did the design team approach this? And again, I think there's a similar message to what Oliver gave. The design team decided to use what they called the environmental design matrix. It was used both to establish targets, understand current practice, and evaluate the efficacy of options under consideration. And these were all the categories. So basically, everything about sustainability, we used eco-homes and mainly eco-homes and BREEAM for the categories. So site use, building form, operational energy, embodied energy and environment, lifestyle targets, and target ratings. And you can see here that they're broken down. So this whole one here is embodied energy and environment, all of that, and then you've got other categories. And the way it worked is, this was basic, this is best practice, and this was exemplar. And the green is what we picked. So we investigated each one. Now obviously for old buildings, you do have to look at them individually. You can't blanket something across all of these buildings. You can't just say this is going to work everywhere. You do have to assess it individually, and you have to understand what's going to work best for this building and what isn't. And so that's what the team did. They didn't go exemplar on everything. Sometimes they had to pull back. Maybe the building didn't have the right orientation, or it didn't have the right roof area for certain things. Like, you do have to make sensible choices. You may not every time be able to go exemplar. The other thing that the team looked at, because the feedback from planning was, oh, we don't like all this, what if you just did that? What if you just did some roof panels? And what we found was that you really can't extrapolate one portion of the building from the others. That all these arrows work together. Although we break it down into these are the interventions work in harmony and they complement each other. You can't have mechanical heat ventilation with heat recovery unless your air tightness is under 6. If it's over 6, you're going to be losing it anyway. So then you're running fans that are useless. They have to work together. You have to understand how all the systems that you want to do complement each other. And so this was the design team. Now the arrows are all in the same place. So you can see that the most drastic reductions have been made from the air tightness and from the wall insulation. We've put on a mansard. We've got lots of renewables. And then we're interested in looking at some other materials. So phase change materials are going in. We're not sure they're going to work. Not 100% convinced. The manufacturers say they're going to work. Now, this goes back to things like future climate, because obviously this is all built to today's temperature standards. But if it gets hotter and you have no cooling, what are these people going to want to do? They're going to want to stick in air conditioners, and that's going to jack up the electricity. And we want to avoid air conditioners. Well, how do you do that? And so some of the ways are things like brise-soleil on the back to make sure that you can reduce direct solar radiation gains because that's south facing. But this phase change material idea, can you cool? Is it possible to add some cooling? Manufacturers say yes, test results say yes, we're going to test it in practice. And that's the point. The point of this project was not to say this is absolutely the answer, but there isn't enough information, we don't know how it works, and someone needs to go ahead and try it. It seems like it might work, Grosvenor's willing to go ahead and try it.
Easier only works if it's cold overnight, to sort of cool it down.
Well, it has to drop, so it absorbs up to a certain temperature that it holds, and then as long as the room temperature does drop, it should start releasing. Will it work? You know, it's interesting, you know, obviously the manufacturers are saying it's the next best thing since sliced bread, but they're willing to test it, and I think that's what's important here. We do need people willing to test it. You can see down here, we were at 29 tons, and the new scheme goes to 6, which works like this. So on the far left, now because the building was a hotel, it wasn't monitored in occupancy beforehand, and it wouldn't be the same use anyway, so it wouldn't be a fair comparison. So the building was assessed based on the retrofit for the future baseline. You've got all the problems I said before with SAP ratings and everything else, but it is standardized, so we used it. This is the typical current Grosvenor refurbishment scheme, which is what they're doing just down the street. And you get, you know, you do get a 45% reduction, which is not bad. Now this building originally went in for planning at a 66% savings, carbon savings, and it went to planning, it went to officers and councillors, and they said, it's great that you're doing this project. Are you telling us this is the best it can be? Okay, so Grosvenor went back with the design team, and 6 months later they said, no, we can get it to 83%. But it was really tweaking some of those, going back through every decision in the matrix, I think there had been cooling potentially at the upper floor, they took it out. Things like that. So it went from an EPC B-rated scheme to an A-rated scheme, but it's important to note that it went from a 20% additional cost to a 30% additional cost. So this does not come cheap. Now, if that wasn't enough, there was a lot of debate about this project, and I will say that Westminster Council is very dubious and cautious and much less enthusiastic about sustainable retrofit than Oliver has suggested Cambridge officers are, although I think some of the ones I've met here have not been as enthusiastic. So what we did is the council required or requested a test room. So let's talk about budget for a second, because if you want to get through a project in planning, do you have the budget and time to do a whole test room of materials and finishes and features that you may have to take out? And do you have the time to do that on a project? It's really quite challenging. So one of the biggest issues was this issue of windows. Windows come up all the time. Now, the picture on the left is the window from the test room. Obviously, it's not a detailed close-up picture, but I would say from this view, can you see a difference between any of the panes in particular? No. But there are three types of glazing options in that window you're looking at, and this is how they show up under thermal imaging. So you have the original windows, which have just been, the original windows that have just been cleaned up and tightened up and all draft sealed, pretty leaky. Here's the histoglass that Oliver was talking about, although you can just make out here the glazing bars are still quite leaky because each one is a pane. And here's the spatia, which is a vacuum sealed, even thinner option. Now you see the glazing bars are removed, and that's because it is a single sheet of glass that goes the whole way through, but it does perform better. We did this because although we talk about these windows a lot, people don't know what they look like. They feel uncomfortable. I do think Oliver's test was good. I did suggest to the team that they should take someone to a street and say, pick out the window, that's a much better way to go about it. It's a little bit difficult. This is a very emotional issue. There's no other way to discuss that. We can discuss it technically, but that's not how people engage with the window. If they walk up to the window and they go, I don't like that. That's how they act. That's how the planners acted. That's how the councillors acted. They had a very emotional response. It doesn't matter that the performance is what the performance is. It has very much to do with how they feel about the window, and that was how it was judged. The other key issue in the test room, so again, this is a photograph of the test room, was how this insulation should be applied. Now, this option is similar to what Oliver showed. So this is a panel of insulation that would be applied to the wall, and you would leave it cut just below the original cornice and the original skirting board so you could still see the original features. But then we were saying you could actually just move the wooden skirting board. It's not that exciting, and it's easy to move, and you could preserve the original cornice behind the insulation, and you could put on a new cornice so that you could have a full insulation. And so we show both options here. This is with the cut back, and this is with the piece moved. So this is actually both options side by side, and we've had that for the officers and councillors to come and look. What does this look like in the room? How does this room feel? How do you feel about this room? Do you feel that you've lost your heritage? Do you feel that you've destroyed something here in this room? And again, the responses were highly emotional, mainly coming down to things like, I don't like it. Well, I don't like it is very difficult to judge in policy. It's a very challenging issue for design teams and owners and people trying to put projects through. It's not in policy whether someone likes it or not, and it doesn't tell you how to fix that problem. There is nothing that mitigates whether someone likes it or not. So the room has gone through. The project has taken 3 years to go to planning. 3 years seems to be a popular number. It's still in the planning system. It's supposed to get permission in a week or two. It actually went to committee once already, and there was no decision, which I think was a precedent for the first time ever. Even English Heritage said that was unprecedented. The planning officers have been highly reluctant to put the scheme forward because they see that their fear is that Grosvenor will use this as a template or use it as a stamp to stamp it out. Whereas I would argue the team has never suggested they would use it as a template, that the whole sensitivity of the design matrix and picking things that are appropriate for each building shows a deep understanding of the fact that each building is unique and must be treated uniquely, but there is a mistrust between the council and the client. And I think that this is common across the country. I've heard many stories in the course of my PhD about people having exactly this problem, and we aren't overcoming it well. And I think part of the reason we aren't overcoming it well is that we don't have the policies available for people to go back and rely on. It comes back to these emotional issues. It comes back to how people feel. And they have no concrete policy to support on either side. You know, you're talking about this harm and benefit issue. You're talking about better or worse without being told how to make better or worse judgments. So these are some of the things I think are the biggest issues that we've really got to get our heads around. The first one is windows. So here's some different options of windows. Like Oliver was saying, you have this double effect. A lot of secondary glazing, which is the second window, is what is the most promoted by English Heritage and everyone else, mainly because when it all gets better, you can take it away. Right? That's the idea. We can keep it like it is because one day it might get better, and then we can just remove that and it'll go back to how it was. And I think that's very short-sighted, but also, as an architect myself, and Oliver referred to this, it changes the whole role and look of what a window is to the street and how a window operates for people. It becomes much thicker and heavier. It doesn't open the same. It's not a thin, translucent material between public and private or public and semi-private space. It becomes much chunkier. It actually does change the character of spaces, and no one's really talking about it that way. They're really talking about, oh, you should just keep it how it is. Now, the other problem is, when we say keep it how it is, what if it's not original? So in the case study, 80% of the windows had been replaced at some time. Only about 20% of the glazing bars or wood was original, and there were 5 different types of profiles. So the architects went in, they properly measured every glazing bar. 5 different types of glazing bars. Only 1 was original. And they said, well, if we refurbish the windows, we'll do new wood windows with the proper profile with the slimline double glazing. We'll have highly efficient windows that will look identical to the original window. And they said, no loss of fabric. No loss of fabric. But the fabric's not original. It doesn't matter, it's listed. These are the types of arguments that you just go around and around in a circle. It can be very challenging. So I think this is something that we have to think, what are we protecting? What is it? Are we protecting the fabric or the intent? And then, like I said, it comes back to this idea of character. How does the street change when every window starts to get chunky? That does actually change the feel of the street. This other issue of insulation. Insulation, there's a new study out by, Caliber, Project Caliber. They've done an interesting study recently about retrofit measures and about what you should do first. If you have to do something first, what do you do first and what has the biggest impact? And they said it's insulation. You must do the insulation first if you have to stage it, because everything sort of hinges off of getting that down. So it's critical to find suitable measures for these properties. Everyone's worried about the interstitial moisture and the floor rot and the cold bridging and all of these issues, and that's fair, but we've got to move past worrying about it and get on the ground and start getting stuff out there and try it, because we can't leave all these buildings being leaky and cold. And I would say one of the really big ways to look at that is, why are we so fussed about the rear elevations of buildings in urban blocks? Now, out in the countryside, a listed building, historic building, which sits on its own and may be viewed from all sides, fair enough. But you look at the back of a lot of these buildings, and the back of the buildings are not special. They were never built to be special, and they've had a lot of alterations and extensions over time. And again, once they're listed, you can't touch it. So I know someone who has a property with like a 1980s extension off the back, and they can't touch the 80s extension because it falls under the listing. It's clearly not original. why can't you touch the 80s extension? It doesn't make any sense at all. So I think we need to be a little more flexible about our rear extensions and how we could insulate. Because it'd be a lot easier to insulate on the exterior. You don't lose floor space, you don't have this kind of cold bridging issue, you have continuous insulation. It's a much better option. There are detailing issues, but if it's on the back, if it's on the non-public face, why are we getting that worked up about it if it means maybe we can do a better job on the front? And so this idea of character, now English Heritage has done a lot lately to try and identify character, but I don't think they're there yet in the sense where they talk about it, but they don't really tell you what to do, and they still have this very sensitive approach to not taking a stand, but I can take a stand because I'm not English Heritage. I do feel very passionately about urban spaces. Like I said, I'm an architect, but my specialty is urban design, and I care a lot about the way streets feel and places feel and the way people interact with the spaces around them, and I think that's desperately important. So when I look at a street and I think about the character, you know, I think about what that means and how much is it going to matter if these windows kind of look the same or changed. I don't think that's what matters. I think things like, I pulled this picture, can you just make out these black lines here? Those are not original. Those are toilet stacks and water pipes, because none of these buildings had water once upon a time, and yet no one says, let's take all those black pipes off the front because they're ugly and they aren't original and they're destroying the character, because you couldn't tell these people they can't have running water and toilets, but we tell them they can't have energy efficiency because we still think energy efficiency is nice and not necessary, and I think that's a problem as well. I think it's important to understand that not everything that's old is good, and not everything that's listed is original. And I kind of like this picture, because it just talks about, we have to let people modernize, but maybe there's better ways. If we were a bit more sensitive and engage with people more about what they really needed, maybe we could find better ways to do both. And I think, hopefully the case study shows that there are better ways to do both, but we're still running up against this fear within the policy system that you're going to get it wrong, you're going to ruin something, it's better to do nothing. So the last message, I think, is that we really do need to understand the buildings better, and that traditional buildings do perform differently in some respects to modern buildings. And you do need different assessment procedures, which frankly, most people are not trained on. Most of the clients, most building owners will not know anything about the technology or techniques necessary to even assess the buildings they have. They get overwhelmed and confused by all the conflicting messages and materials that are available, and we're not doing a very good job as an industry or even as academics to make good messages for regular people. And we can spend all our time talking about the buildings, and I like this picture too, because there's that quote, buildings don't use energy, people do. And we can do loads to improve the buildings, loads and loads. But this is a study done by Parity Projects, where basically they took 40 identical homes, and this is the energy use of each home from 40 different households. So the size of the circle is the amount of energy, and obviously the partitions show how they use their energy differently. There is no one fit answer. There is no one way to address every household and every people or group occupying a building. It's got to be both. And we need to stop pointing fingers and saying it's this or it's that. It's everything, and you've got to think holistically about these buildings. But hopefully, if I've gotten anything through, the messages, and from Oliver's as well, massive savings are completely possible, and you don't ruin the heritage, and you can achieve it, and we just aren't getting there yet, and it's a problem. And that's it. Yeah.
I've got a question. The word holistic has come up quite a lot today.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, you know, when we're thinking that, especially about something that Oliver said, but you sort of touched on as well, which is for these kinds of clients, cost savings don't really seem to make that much of a difference, and that's not always wasted. And Oliver said, you know, for Trinity, it was the comfort and well-being and productivity which they were interested in, I assume those have something similar for both.
Yeah.
But then, are we kind of moving away from sustainability in a way? Because that's sort of just good design, right? Or is sustainability still useful as a sort of package or a framework that you can go to the planners and say, these are all things which are all part of this holistic package?
I suppose I would challenge you to think that why doesn't sustainability mean good design as opposed to energy savings or even carbon savings? Like, why don't we think of sustainability as a minimum standard of excellent design, which delivers lower energy bills, carbon savings, healthy living, and all of these things?
Yeah, so maybe it's the mentality that sustainability is something extra that people do work.
Well, exactly.
The architects, but you sort of think the architects as a minimum should be doing good design. They should be doing quality work.
Yeah, but then you run into trouble that either you're told you can't by planners. There's a lot of people who may want to do energy efficient retrofits. I think what's interesting about both of these talks is you have two clients with extremely long-term objectives and huge pots of money. That's hardly typical. So if each of these projects has taken 3 years, how many individual everyday homeowners have wanted to get something done in that 3-year time period who've just given up because it's just been too challenging? And how often does a building have a deep retrofit of this level? Every 40 to 60 years. So if you miss your window now, it doesn't come up for 40 to 60 years. And this is when I said, we need to stop thinking about it as something nice. I think this is the problem. We think about energy efficiency, energy savings. Oh, it's going to save you some money on your energy bills. It's a nice thing to do. It's not a necessary thing to do. And that's the thinking that I think needs to shift. We should think of sustainability as a requirement, like water, like a toilet, like your kitchen tap. You shouldn't think of it as a nice add-on. You should think, I can't have a house without it. And we aren't there yet. But I would hope that's all of the pressures, all of the multiple pressures, hopefully are pushing us slowly that way. But it will take time.
So do you think it's then useful to have this notion of sustainability, which does bring all these different ideas together still, do the planners still respond to it in that way?
Yes, because they have targets. Planners respond to it because they understand they have targets, and councillors understand to it because there is this kind of, there's this reduction commitment that all the councils have to hit. Westminster, I'm looking at 13 inner London boroughs, so zone 1 and zone 2 in London. Not a single one of my boroughs, if I average them, let's say, 80% of all the emissions come from the buildings, not 40. It's quite tricky. So in cities, the energy emissions, the carbon emissions from buildings, significantly higher. You cannot reach your target. The councils will not be able to reach their requirements without addressing the building stock. The way they understand it is sustainability. As long as that's how they understand it, that's how it has to keep being, I think.
If they had to implement measures saying that you cannot sell your building unless it meets a certain standard, but then at the same time they're saying that you cannot change certain things, isn't that kind of contradictory to each other?
Yes, and what they've done is they've put exemptions in at the moment. So,
Exemptions which way?
that traditional buildings and historic buildings may be exempt from the requirement. And so that's core as well, right? So that's actually exempting the worst performing buildings because they don't want to deal with it. And it's not going to be true in every case. Currently, that there are exemptions for, there's exemptions in the building regulations for Part L. You don't have to meet Part L. If you have a listed building or your building's in a conservation area, you are exempted from meeting Part L if, through the planning department, believes the changes needed to meet Part L will adversely affect the heritage qualities, then you're exempted from meeting Part L. So there's this real problem with national policies that the government clearly wants something, but they aren't providing enough support. They're not prioritizing well, they're not helping people achieve it, and they're kind of dumping it on local planners. This is where I think localism doesn't work. That, those decisions need to be made at a higher level. Someone needs to provide guidance for local councils, not leave it up to local councils who've also had their budgets cut. And they're supposed to suddenly learn this stuff and make priorities. They don't know how.
The standard retrofit,
Yeah.
could that reach UPC level D?
The standard one,
Yeah.
C.
Oh, no, so actually, that would have been good enough for
Yeah.
Energy Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The standard one's not bad. They are aware they could do better, and they're interested in doing better. And they also see in the long term, I mean, as everything shifts, as all buildings shift, they see a C won't be a C.
So what's in the standard one compared to?
It's like an eco homes level 3. It's about a 3.
But I mean, it must still have insulation and windows and.
Nope. May have some secondary glazing. I'm not even sure it does. No, it does have secondary glazing. It doesn't have much insulation. Everything's kind of standard. No mechanical heat loss, no air tightness testing. They haven't improved the air tightness. They've just kind of done the insulation, done secondary glazing. It obviously makes improvements. I mean, just to refresh the materials and stuff does help, but it's
Is it all on the condensing boilers then? I mean, that must make a difference.
they're combi boilers. Yeah.
Just new boilers will get you quite a long way if they're bad enough to start with.
Yeah, well, actually, the high scheme is using combi boilers.
Yeah, they're still condensing what they can.
Yeah. And we wouldn't have hit, I mean, in fairness, that there's no way the project would achieve these levels without the amount of renewables. Renewables are a huge part
What is the percentage there? I can't read that.
of which percentage?
Of the renewable energy savings?
36%. So we went from 6 to 36. That was a large part of the extra gap. There's just no way to do it without,
When you went to the council the first time, they go, can you do better?
Yeah,
Next time you go to them, they go, we can't make up our minds.
yeah.
Was there a change in the people on the council or something? Why did that?
Well, it's been very politically curious. The councillor, the ward councillor, whose ward this falls under, was the one who was very excited and very interested, and he said, yes, we should be doing this, yes, it's great. I mean, Westminster has 11,000 listed buildings, so this is a big deal for them. He was very excited about it, and it would have originally gone to his planning committee. It became so political and topical and sensitive that actually higher level people in the council decided it would not go to his planning committee, that it would go to someone else's planning committee, because he was too involved. The other person, feeling in the middle of this horrible situation, didn't want to make a decision. It's been very curious to watch, and also to watch the interplay between the councillors and the officers. Councillors elected, and officers kind of truck on working. There's been loads of issues and conflicts and conflicting opinions, and many cooks in the pot, and many. When we did the test room, at least 60 people have been given presentations about the building in the test room, including local councillors, local planning officers, Georgian group, Victorian group, English Heritage, other interested parties.
And this is one house.
Yeah.
I mean, and if this isn't a precedent for other houses, then all over again for every house.
Obviously, Grosvenor's hope is the learning from this project can then be applied. But this is why I was trying to ask Oliver. I think there is a real issue with understanding the challenge. Here we are saying to you, we've got these clients, they've made good, interesting projects. It should not be belittled that it's taken 3 years and that you had to pay your consultants for 3 years, or your consultants have blown through their fee and they're now working for free because it's such a high profile project with such publicity that they're willing to work for free for marketing. They're not going to do that for the average person on an average property. It's not going to happen. And I do think that's a big problem as well. If this is what it takes, is it any wonder we're not getting projects through planning? It's not easy. Yeah.
Do you have any information on how the environmental conditions improve? was different usually for
Yeah, I mean, the best way is kind of to look at the room in a way. Like, they're standard rooms. There weren't many features. Like I said, it wasn't listed for the internal features. It's a standard straight room, staircase, or...
but also the thermal conditions. Is there
Oh, well,
information?
yeah, I mean, the external walls go to a 0.5, is it? From 7.7?
7.
Yeah. And air leakage was 6.9 tons to 0.4 tons. So the internal conditions should be more comfortable. There should be much less draft. It should be more comfortable, more consistently temperate. It's all low VOC and nice materials in a way, so it should be healthy materials, a healthy environment. Presumably the internal conditions should be more pleasant. But you can also see from the test room in a way, all you have to do is kind of tidy it up, and it was pretty grotty before, but they're simple boxes. They're not complicated rooms. Yeah.
Where are you putting the PCM? The
The-
phase change materials.
The phase change, whoops, other way. They're all going in these rooms here. So this is the south facing rooms. And this is bedroom, maybe not in the 2 bedrooms.
Are in the walls or in the ceiling or in the floor?
Ceiling, and possibly some walls. Definitely all ceiling, yeah.
You changed the roof quite
Yes.
significantly.
Yeah, and this was a big deal for the planners. So here, this is an explanation of things that go wrong with planners. Original building, this is an inverted butterfly roof. This is 2.1 meters or 2.2 floor to head space. I mean, I can touch the ceiling, I'm short. There is no space at the head beam to provide significant insulation. First problem, you can't get insulation on that roof. Second problem, the building next door, here, this is kind of south, so their mansard overshadows the whole roof. So not only would we not get insulation, we can't get any renewables. So we said we wanted to put on a mansard roof, because the mansard roof would allow us to properly insulate the roof, and it would get us above the shadow line so we could do PVs and solar thermals. And the council said, you're a developer, you just want more space. Well, this is again one of those challenges, right? You do get more space. Why is that a problem? Why does it have to be so antagonistic? You're improving the energy efficiency and you get more space. Can't we see that as a win-win, as opposed to the message that clearly came through from the planning officers, which was you're just being a greedy developer and you just want more space? How do you make that argument? You know, what are you supposed to say? Yes, you do get more space, and certainly they're not unhappy about it, but had it been feasible, probably, to just do it normally, they would have done it. But when they picked this project, I mean, the other project further down, they're not putting a mansard on, 125, it's not getting one. So,
Was it an official opinion, or it was just one person said it?
oh no, this was a massive problem.
So it was like somebody said, you want to increase the space in this problem.
Yeah, but it all went back to the listing. So they said, so we said, for example, this is going to be very hard to see here. These 2 buildings clearly have mansards. Here's our building, and this building. So these 5 are the group. This one and this one have rounded top windows. These 3 are square. This one and this one step forward 1 brick wide, and the others are 3 back. So we said, actually, these 3 should read, I mean, if you're going to list it as a group, let's talk architecture. If it's listed as a group, these 3 should read as a unit, because it reads pop out, 3, pop out. That's how it reads. And they said, no, you're making it up. Well, you're clearly not making it up. And then they said, but we don't like these mansards. And you say, okay, you don't like them, but they're there. So we want a mansard to match the other, so it reads as 3, and they go, well, no, you can see on the street there aren't that many mansards, so we don't want them. And this is the type of argument you have, and you feel very frustrated. It's very disheartening in some ways, because it is the perspective of many councils to be wary, very wary of what your motives are, what you want, very wary of the developer. In many cases, probably true, but can't we have mature conversations about it?
I think it's also what you suggested is about uncertainty. Is uncertainty also on the side of their conservationists and planners? They also don't want to make a mistake, because first of all, we understand that the conservation movements are starting in the 19th century. It still has this kind of the argument why English heritage was set up to protect the historic environment. The definitions are changing slowly, so we now have this historic environment definitions, which includes interaction with the people. So it's not anymore buildings or built publicly as said, but in the minds and the approaches of conservation officers who were working maybe for 30 years or in this environment, it's still sometimes, as you said, it's kind of remittals, residuals from their so not following yet their policies or not entirely confident to use them. They don't have a methodology in place how to use it and how to communicate with the new agenda of sustainability, which is a little bit frightening for them as well. So how it will impact on their position as somebody who actually looks after the historic features. So I think this Oliver's idea and approach to actually engage them in a proper way with their language, to understand what is valuable.
It works if they're open to it. What I would suggest to you is in this council, they would be quite familiar with all of these arguments, and they're very confident in their own arguments. I mean, for example, so the 2 biggest contentions, the windows, the 3 biggest, we gave up on the windows actually in a way. The windows were probably the biggest contention, the mansard, and then the rear extension was the other. So the previous rear extension was later. This was a late Victorian extension. It's in bad condition. It kind of hangs on funny. And there's this 1 meter, the neighbor on this side has a full height extension and the neighbor adjacent. So this building actually has party walls on either side. The extensions are not consistently to one side. The proposal was to do a full width extension, although not as far out, and do this kind of modern greenhouse idea, because you would get air. It's a way of providing an air gap, and this has been very contentious. And so the new solution they want that 1 meter gap back, so that it's not full width. This has been the final sticking point actually, is that you can't have a full width extension. I think they have negotiated for a full width extension that sets in and then it's glazed, so it looks like solid and glazed. It's been quite tricky. And then you just think it's the back. I mean, again, to me, it's the back. It's a rear extension. It was never built to be special from this side. Is this where the argument should really be? And for that matter, why can't you externally insulate the whole rear? Because all the other buildings are brick. What if all the other buildings were render? What if we start here and then they all end up as render eventually? It's a weird argument. I find it a weird argument, personally. But that, again, that's my opinion, right? So this is the problem with the planning system currently. Everyone has an opinion. The policy isn't there to truly support. You can twist it to support your opinion, no matter what your opinion is. So it's a challenge.
And it could be stronger in your opinion, then it will be.
Yeah, so that's when you have fist fights on site. It's great.
Arguments.
Anyway, yeah. But all of this is also available. You can look at the full planning application on Westminster's planning application site. So if you look up 119 Ebury Street, you can get all the details. It has all the environmental reports and all the testing reports and the heritage reports. So if anyone's interested in more of the detail, it's all publicly available.